Well, good afternoon again, everyone. I want to begin with a question here for the sermon this afternoon. It's a question actually that I think that Mr. Robinson covered with the Gospels and how they were transmitted here recently, but maybe begin thinking about this. And the question is, are the New Testament Gospels reliable? Specifically, are the eyewitness accounts of the writers credible and reliable? It made me think last week when Mr. Barnett opened his sermonette with the question, what if everything in here was true? It's kind of a pointed question, and it really struck me when he asked that. What if everything in here is true? What does that mean? And I'm not going to cover that, but I think as the time goes on in this age, and we see more and more people relying on themselves for what they consider their own salvation, and for what the government's going to do for them, and what other people will do. Everyone's come up with this victim mentality. Nobody's responsible for anything anymore. People don't look to the Bible. And we've been saying this for years, but it's getting more and more this way, that the Bible is being ridiculed, it's being poo-pooed. How could you look to an old ancient book that's been covered up for years for anything? Because it's not reliable. Well, that's the question I really want to ask today and address in maybe a little bit different way than we've looked at before. It's a large subject, but I'm just going to try and take one piece of it and try and bite that piece off today. So in some ways, you can look at this as an apologetic sermon. And I know we believe the Bible here, so I'm not going to tell you anything new as trying to convince you of this. I know that. But it could add to your faith. And also for our youngsters here, and even if you're talking to somebody, here's some points you can bring up to make them think, well, wait a second, I've never thought about that before. Maybe I need to consider this. So this could be a way that you could help someone else who needs witness to understand the truths of the Bible. So as you're aware, the Bible is not just one book, but it's a collection of 66 books, which are divided into two sections. The first section, and the largest, is the Old Testament of 39 books, and the New Testament has 27 in that book area. So 27 books containing the New Testament. The entire Bible was written over a period of about 1,600 years by more than 40 authors. That's a long time span where a lot of things can go wrong. 40 different authors who could say a lot of different things that could contradict each other all over the place. We don't find that. These people came from all different kinds of backgrounds. We have kings, we have diplomats, poor people, fishermen, we have tent makers. We have poor people like the prophet Amos, who had a dirty and lowly job in society, a caretaker of sycamore fig trees. We have a great cross-section of people writing the Bible. The Bible was originally written in three languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And it was written on three continents: Asia, Africa, and Europe. And this speaks against the idea that Christianity is just some Western religion or is just a product of one culture and has been used for cultural imperialism. The Bible is its own greatest apologetic against that. The Bible's social, geographical, and culture in its context, original context, was then quickly multiplied because the New Testament manuscripts in particular were copied very quickly in the 1st and 2nd centuries and translated into multiple languages and spread across the known world. What that means is that when we come to today and we ask the question, what is the Bible? What is the New Testament, and is it reliable? We have thousands and thousands of manuscripts upon which we can look to, on which we base our text. Now, the integrity of any writing is determined by a number of things, but two things are really important. Number one is the number of documented manuscripts or fragments of manuscripts that we have. So that's the first thing. The second thing is called the time-distance relationship between the manuscripts that survived and when the events occurred. So obviously, if there's a large time distance between a manuscript and the history that it purports to write about, it's going to be generally less trustworthy than manuscripts that were written closer to the events that it talks about. then, there are caveats to this rule, of course, but that's a general rule. So how do New Testament manuscripts compare to other manuscripts in relation to these two questions? If we look at the works of the ancient philosopher Plato, for example, there are 7 existing copies of the ancient manuscript, and these can be studied and compared in order to determine the accuracy and quality of the transmission of his writings throughout the years. The oldest of these manuscripts is a copy dating about 1,400 years after the work in question was originally written. 1,400 years is the first one we have. Even today, the text is read and it's respected. But when it comes to the Bible, we have over 5,600 handwritten New Testament manuscripts in the Greek language alone that help us to ensure the accuracy of its writings. And many of the earliest copies are separated from the originals not by 1,400 years, this is in the case of Plato, but by a mere 25 to 50 years. Very short time distance period. In addition to the 5,600 known Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, add to that 10,000 Latin manuscripts and 9,300 early portions of the New Testament, and we total over 20,000 text and manuscript copies or portions of the New Testament. No other document from antiquity even approaches this number. The nearest number of manuscripts that comes even close to this massive number of 20,000 is Homer's Iliad, with a mere 634. The first complete text of Homer dates from the 13th century AD, no less, although there are much earlier fragments of the manuscript. The scholar John Warwick Montgomery wrote this. He said, "To be skeptical of the resultant text of the New Testament books is to allow all of classical antiquity to slip into obscurity. For no documents of the ancient world is well attested bibliographically as the New Testament." And people who don't believe in God love to go to the classics of antiquity. F.F. Bruce, a textual critic of the New Testament, wrote this: "There's no body of ancient literature in the world that enjoys such a wealth of good textual attestation as the New Testament." In fact, in his book, The Bible and Archaeology, Sir Frederick Kenyon, a former director and principal librarian of the British Museum, stated about the New Testament, he said this: "The interval, then, between the dates of original composition and the earliest extant evidence became so small as to be, in fact, negligible, and the last foundation for any doubt that the Scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed. Both the authenticity and the general integrity of the books of the New Testament may be regarded as finally established." Now, there are some good examples of ancient New Testament manuscripts. For example, there is the Codex Vaticanus, the Codex Sinaiticus, which are parchment copies of the entire New Testament dating from the 4th century AD. Earlier still, there are fragments of papyri of portions of the New Testament dating from 100 to 200 years before Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. The very oldest portion of the Bible surviving today is a fragment of papyrus codex containing John 18, verse 31 through 37. John 18, verses 31 to 33 and verse 37. And it's called the Rylands Papyrus, P52. A lot of times they'll just call it P52. And it dates from about 130 AD. I've seen different dates, but it seems 130 AD. It was found in Egypt and has caused academia to place the fourth gospel back into the 1st century, abandoning the 19th century assertion that it could not have been written then by the Apostle John. I think they found it in a trash heap. They found several of these manuscripts in a trash heap. We also have quotations from the New Testament and the writings of what are called the Church Fathers. Mr. Robinson talked about this. They point to the relatively early completion of the New Testament. This is important to understand when the New Testament was completed, because we know about the times that the Church Fathers wrote. German scholarship of the 19th and early 20th centuries argued for the New Testament written a couple hundred years after the events it recorded. And this led many people to distrust the contents of the New Testament. They said it's far too distant for it to be reliable, believing that it was simply made up by the church so long ago after the events that it was written about. But the discovery of early fragments of the New Testament and the writings of the church fathers provide us with good evidence for a short period of time between the events themselves and the Gospels which describe them. For example, the Epistle of Clement to the Corinthians, and this is dated AD 95, cites verses from the Gospels, Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, Titus, Hebrews, and 1 Peter from 95 AD. The letters of Ignatius, dated 115 AD, were written to several churches in Asia Minor and cite verses from Matthew, John, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Titus. These letters indicate that the entire New Testament was written within the 1st century AD. There is other internal evidence for his 1st century date for the writing of the New Testament. For instance, the book of Acts ends abruptly with Paul in prison awaiting his trial. And you can see that in Acts 28 and verse 30 and 31. And it's likely that Luke wrote Acts during this time, before Paul finally appeared before Caesar, which would be about 62 to 63 AD, meaning that Acts and Luke's gospel were written within 30 years of the ministry and death of Jesus Christ. Further evidence of this is that there is no mention of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, although Matthew, Mark, and Luke record Jesus' prophecy that the temple would be destroyed within the next generation. No New Testament book refers to this event as ever having happened. It's likely that these letters then were written prior to 70 AD, otherwise they might have mentioned the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy. In addition to the actual Greek manuscripts, there are more than 1,000 copies in fragments of the New Testament in Syrian, Coptic, Armenian, Gothic, and Ethiopic, as well as 8,000 copies of the Latin Vulgate, some of which date almost to Jerome's original translation in AD 384 to 400. There's a lot of evidence here for an early writing. I mentioned that the early church fathers have multiple quotes from the New Testament in their writings, and this itself is a witness to an early date for the completed New Testament. How many quotations are there? According to Daniel Wallace, a preeminent textual critic at Dallas Theological Seminary, there are more than 1 million quotations. 1 million quotations. Which means that if all the New Testament, ancient New Testament manuscripts were to somehow disappear overnight, it would be possible to reconstruct the entire New Testament with the exception of 20 verses from all the church fathers. And I know Mr. Robinson mentioned you could recreate the whole thing. So what does this mean? What does it mean? That we have overwhelming evidence of an early writing and copies of the New Testament? Well, it means that we don't have some mythical time distance from the time the Bible was written to the events of the Bible. It was very close together. And this leaves no time for the legendary accumulation of stories to happen that atheists claim. Now, Bart Ehrman, if you know Bart Ehrman, he's awful to listen to. The arrogance it oozes out of him. He's a textual critic who studied under Bruce Metzger, whom many consider one of the best textual critics ever to live. Ehrman, who once claimed he was a Christian at one point, claims that he studied the New Testament, which drove him to be an atheist. He debated Dan Wallace, I mentioned he's another textual critic who's a Christian, in 2012. It was a very big debate. It was a very major debate. They debated about the veracity of the New Testament scriptures. This is what Bart Ehrman hung his hat on at the debate that I watched. And he challenges Christians by saying this. He says, "What do you suppose happens to the stories about Jesus over the years as they were told and retold, not as disinterested new stories reported by eyewitnesses, but as propaganda meant to convert people to faith, told by people who had themselves been told them fifth or sixth or 19th hand? Do you or your kids ever play the telephone game? And so this is what he said during the debate. Of course, I think you all know what the telephone game is, right? So you take a room full of people, and the first person relates the story to the second person, and then the second to the third, and so on and so on. And you go all throughout the room, and as you get to the end of 20 or 30 people, the story at the other end rarely resembles anything like the original story. It's actually a fun little game to play. Now, many times people will change the details on purpose to make it more crazy. But even if they try to keep the details, and the more details there are, the more difficult it is to transmit that particular story. But often when you get to the end, the details fall out. And people can't remember those details. They eventually disappear as they get to the end. And so the story becomes quite less colorful, less entertaining in some ways. Well, is the transmission of the New Testament like the telephone game? This is what Bart Ehrman says. How can we trust it? The difference between the telephone game and the transmission of the New Testament really are many. First, when you come to the New Testament, there's not just one line of communication. There are multiple lines of communication with the same story, multiple lines of communication. Hundreds, actually, and even thousands that go on. So they're not just start from one source. We have these multiple eyewitnesses, and when we look at the New Testament, it's not as if we can only speak to the 20th person at the end of the line. We actually can speak to maybe the second or the third. We can get very early on. What we have and what the earliest copyists had were multiple witnesses. A textual critic doesn't just rely on the last person, but he can interrogate the many scribes over the centuries. The process isn't meant to be some silly little game, muddling up the message for the person in the end. No, the rules were put in place to ensure the transmission of the New Testament and that it was done in a faithful way. And there were rules to this. Now, when we went to Qumran, this was back in 2005 when we saw the caves, what we were told at the time was that the Essenes, when they were very meticulous about copying the Bible, the scriptures. And when they would mess up, they would roll the scroll up and they would put it in a particular cave, or they'd put it away. In other words, they didn't mark it out, and then just continue on, or, mark it out and put the new thing over top. No, they wanted a complete, correct text. So if they made a mistake, they had to start over. So when we were there recently, Max and I were there, I asked Dr. Price about this. Is this true they put these particular ones in the cave? He said he hadn't heard that. So he didn't know that. But we do know that scribes did do their best to copy things exact and precise. Those were the rules of the game. They didn't make them up as they went along. No matter how small it was, they would make every opportunity. They would take every opportunity to make sure that they were copying this directly as best they could. Anybody ever played the game of golf? I played a few games of golf in my day. Haven't done it for a number of years, but I remember many years ago when we played the game of golf. It was a fun game. Was I actually playing the game of golf? Golf has been handed down for generations and generations and generations. It's a game they call it a game of gentlemen. It's a game that requires discipline, and it has multiple rules in it that makes it the game that it is. It's really the rules that define the game, not the clubs, but the rules tell you how to play the game. Well, if I went golfing with you, and I took you out on the course, and you said, well, you really don't know how golf was played 20 generations ago. We don't even know if it's the same game today that it was 20 generations ago. We don't know what original golf really was. We don't even know what it was like. Would that be an assumption that you would make? Would you assume that if you played golf? No, you wouldn't make that assumption if you went out to play golf, because, as I said, there's a discipline to the game. There were rules that were put in place to make sure the game was played properly, and it was played the same generation after generation after generation. And the same thing applies to the New Testament. They didn't make up the rules as they went along. They followed them all the way down. So there was a process in place that we can interrogate, if we can call it that, the sources along the way since they survived. With the Gospels in particular, we can answer the question about whether this is just legend with a much greater degree of confidence than we could even 15 or 20 years ago, and I want to tell you why. The main question of concern is, are the Gospels really based on eyewitness accounts? Now, the skeptic, like Bart Ehrman, would say that since the Gospels were written outside of the land of which they describe the events, they cannot be eyewitness accounts. Since they were written outside, it's impossible. They can't be eyewitness accounts. That's what he says. He says that they were written miles and miles away by people who had nothing to do with the events that they record. So why should we trust them? Why can't we trust them? Or we say we can't trust them. We can't believe what they have to say. Now, skeptical scholars and traditional scholars agree that the four Gospels were not all written in the land of origin around Israel. They agree with that. Were they written in Israel? No. We mostly agree with that. So, for example, Mark was written in Rome. Luke was written in most likely Antioch, maybe Acacia or Rome. John was written in Ephesus, and it was only Matthew that was most likely written in Judea. So the skeptic will say to us, they were written hundreds of miles away, and maybe even thousands, from the land of the origin of the story. Bart Ehrman says this. He says, we can't trust them. They have no real connection to the events they recorded. Where did these anonymous Greek speaker authors live? Probably outside of Palestine, some 35 to 65 years after the events they narrate. Where did they get the information? He says, end quote. Now, for us, this is a great question. I think it's a legitimate question that we really need to address. In fact, the gospel writers were writing outside of the land. That fact that they were gives us an incredible evidence of the validity of the New Testament scriptures and eyewitness testimony. So this actually helps us, believe it or not, that they were written outside the land. Because what it now means is that we can ask questions about how familiar the writers were with the land that they were talking about. In other words, do they know the land? Do they get the details right? Isn't it fascinating? God made sure that we had a way to ask the questions. Do they get the geography right? Do they get the agriculture right? What about the botany? What about the architecture? Did they get the traditions correct? What about the burial practices? What about the economics? Did they get the language correct? How about the law? Did they get the personal names correct? How about culture? Did they get it all correct? Were they correct in these things? Now, this is a lot of stuff to make up. There's a lot of things here to try and piece together. Could they construct the story without ever having been there? If you've never been to a place, it's hard to get all those kinds of details correct. And if you live thousands of miles away from the place that you have no access to, and they didn't have the internet, which today we can go on the internet and we can kind of snoop in different places. We can look up places. We can actually go to Google Maps and get a view of what it looks like right there. They didn't have anything like that. Their maps wasn't anything detailed like the ones we have. It's exceptionally difficult to get all the details correct. So the first question we can ask is this. What about the names? Real simple question. Did they get the names correct? What were people called, and do the writers call the characters by the right names? Now, this might sound at first like a strange thing. You might ask, how can we even know that anyway? Or it doesn't sound like this will tell us anything about the authenticity of the New Testament eyewitness accounts, but I'm going to show you why it does. It's quite staggering, really. It's really amazing. In 2002, very recent, 2002, a German scholar by the name of Tal Ilan did a study that she called Lexicon of Jewish Names in Late Antiquity, Part 1. That's a snoozer for you. Perfect study, though. She did a comprehensive study of the names that were used by people in Israel during the time of the gospel accounts. So she takes inscriptions, she takes bone boxes, different writings outside of the New Testament, things like the Dead Sea Scrolls and other things, and she studies all the names that comes up. And then she ranks the names to find out what were the most popular names at the time. So she puts this together. Now, per se, that didn't really mean a whole lot. She didn't do anything with it. She just put it out there. But then, Richard Bachman, a professor of New Testament studies at the University of St. Andrews, comes along 4 years later in 2006, and he pulls these names, and he took her study and he compared it with the New Testament. If I were to ask you to go back in history to 1920, just 100 years, and I were to say, can you tell me what the top most popular names were, the 10 most popular names in our own country 100 years ago, would you get it right? Would you get it right? What about England, 1,000 miles away? A society that speaks our own language. I'm going to ask you. Just go ahead. We're going to try and come up with the top 10 names, what you think will be the top 10 names 100 years ago. James, for boys.
Mary.
John.
David.
I think Dan's got to be in there.
Dan.
No way. Dan.
10, that's all I'm asking.
Elizabeth.
Elizabeth?
Taylor.
Okay.
I'm naming old girlfriend.
Who else we got? Ruth. What'd you say? Thomas, okay. Thomas. What?
Lucy. Yeah, Lucy.
Lucy, okay.
Lucy.
Lucy.
Rebecca.
Rebecca.
Rick. Rick would probably be a good one.
Rick? Do we want to put Rick down or no?
Richard.
Okay.
Got it.
Okay.
Any other things? We only have
Rachel.
Rachel.
James.
James? James is there. What? Philip.
Esther.
Esther. Carl?
Taniqua.
Somebody say, okay, Carl.
That was totally funny in my head. Taniqua. Really.
Any, Diane? What? John's in there. Eunice?
Eunice would be good.
Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Susie or Susan.
Susie, and then 2 more for boys. Charles and Joseph. Okay. Okay, let's look and compare and see how we did. By the way, you want to venture a guess on English names while we're at it? England?
And then you go Birmingham versus Southampton.
Let's not do that because it'll take too much time. But, okay, so what I'm trying to point out here is we've got American names. We've also got the English names, right? We speak the same in the UK, separated by thousands of miles. But in Israel, you've got a certain subset of population of the Jews. But in Rome or wherever they wrote, we're talking thousands of miles away, right? Not the same language, so you wouldn't expect the same names either. Okay. So here's the most popular names in 1920 in the U.S. This is interesting, and I will say this. Over the course of 100 years, are still the same as far as popularity. Number 1 in 1920 was Robert. Next was John. We didn't get John. We did get that one. James is third. William. Charles. We get Charles. George. Joseph is next. Richard. Edward. And Donald. So you got 5 of them. That's good. Now, for females, Mary, which has been number 1 for like forever. Dorothy. Helen. Betty. Margaret. Ruth. We did get Ruth, didn't we?
Yeah.
Ruth, okay. Virginia. Doris. Mildred and Francis.
Yeah,
Okay, so you live here. All right, so this is how close you got. Now in the UK, here's the names for men: Gerald, Terence, Daniel, Fred, Alexander, Dennis, Alan, Graham, Edmund, and Martin. You never would have got those. For females, Grace, Nellie, Daphne, Marie, Agnes, Brenda, Pauline, Lucy, Janet, and Eleanor.
we got one. Lucy, right there.
Now, imagine if I were to say to you, forget 100 years ago, can you tell me what the top 10 most popular names in the U.S. right now are? Would you get it right? Probably not.
Mohammedan.
Now, what about a country 1,000 miles away today? You probably wouldn't get it right. So you see where I'm going. We so easily get the people wrong in a place or location, even in a place that's so distant to us. So now the writers of the New Testament are thousands of miles away. Ephesus and Antioch are both over 6,000 miles away from the land of Israel. Even Rome is over 1,000 miles away. And before 2002, the study had not been done. We had no idea what the names were. There was no way to look them up. We didn't do it. No source to learn the names of that particular time in that particular region. So what were the people called in Jewish antiquity? Here's the order of the most popular names at the time, according to outside sources from the Bible. I'm going to say these in order: Simon, Joseph, Lazarus, Judas or Judah, John, Jesus, Ananias, Jonathan, Matthew, Manaen, which I'm not familiar with, and James. We're familiar with all these names. They all sound familiar. If you take the top 9 Israeli Jewish names together, outside the New Testament, they account for 41% of any name usage. Inside the New Testament, they account for 40% of the name usage. In other words, the gospel writers get the names right. They get them right. And this is a pattern that shows up over 4 writers during 5 books, because Luke wrote 2. And those 4 writers writing 5 books, both individually and corporately, each show the same pattern. They reflect the same pattern. Now, here's something else that makes this even more astounding than it already is, which I think it is. If you travel just a few miles away to Egypt, which is about 250 miles at that time, to Cairo, Richard Bauckham does an investigation of Jewish names given to people in Egypt at the same time. Here's the names, just 250 miles away. The most common names used in Egypt are this: Lazarus, Tabotius, Joseph, Dositheus, Pappus, Ptolemaeus, and Samuel. Most of them not even remotely familiar with us, or with what we see in the Bible. The names are largely different, and they're not the same names that we see in the New Testament. So over the matter of just a relatively short distance, the names of what people are called, even in a Jewish community, are different from what they were called in the Israeli Jewish community. And the gospel writers, writing sometimes thousands of miles away, are spot on. It's staggering. Why are they so spot on? Because it's not fake. It's real. They had eyewitness testimony and accounts. They didn't make it up. They didn't draw their own narrative for their own agenda. Now, you could say, if you wanted to, it's a hoax. You'd be ridiculous to say it, but let's say it's a hoax. And they looked into it and they investigated it. These writers, they really knew. They investigated it and they fixed it. Frankly, there's really no explanation for that at all. There's just none. I don't even know how that's possible. This is amazingly strong evidence that the gospel writers writing outside the land of origin were writing from eyewitness testimony. You know what's most amazing about this, though? Not just that they got the names correct, but they got the characteristics of names right. They got the proportions of names right. When Carol and I were choosing names for our children, I didn't want a name, I remember talking about this, I didn't want names that were most popular at the time. wanted something that was just a little bit different. I said, I think I said to her, if they were sitting in class and the teacher said, Liam, would you answer that? And 8 people stand up and answer because I think Liam's the most popular name. It would get kind of confusing. Give them an identity crisis, I think I said. So imagine in the first century, you were to walk around somewhere and call out, Simon! All these people turn because there's so many Simons, because Simon's, it was the number one most popular name? Simon was number 1. Lots of Simons would come running. So what do the gospel writers know? What do they know about this? They know intuitively as eyewitnesses that many of the names, including Simon, they need qualifiers to distinguish them from someone else. So Jesus has 2 Simon disciples. One of them is Simon Peter. The other is Simon the Zealot. Jesus had dinner with Simon the leper. Simon of Cyrene carried the cross. Simon Peter stayed in Acts and with Simon the tanner. They qualified all these Simons. You see, there were a lot of Simons, and you needed to make a distinction between them all. What about Mary? What about Mary? Mary was the most common name. We see Mary, the mother of Jesus. We see Mary Magdalene, Mary of Bethany, Mary, the mother of John Mark, Mary, the mother of Joseph, Mary of Rome, Mary, the wife of Clopas. All have qualifiers on them because it was a popular name. In Matthew chapter 10, I want you to look here in Matthew chapter 10, so if you would turn over there, we have a list of the disciples. Now, remember that the gospel writers had not read any research. They didn't have the internet. They didn't know any of this stuff in advance, to try and figure this stuff out. They had no way of getting background or information to concoct these stories. They just knew the reality of the eyewitness accounts. What you will see the writers doing is that when names are incredibly popular, they disambiguate that name by giving it a qualifier. And where names are not incredibly popular, they just leave the name as it is because they weren't a common name. They would not have needed to distinguish the names to show who the individual was. So look at Matthew chapter 10 and verse 1. It says, "And when he called unto him his 12 disciples, he gave them power against unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal all manner of sicknesses, all manner of disease. Now the names of the 12 apostles are these. The first, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the publican, James, the son of Alphaeus, Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him." So Simon, who ranks number 1, he says, is also called Peter, and Andrew, his brother. James ranks number 11, a very high-ranking name on the list, has a qualifier as the son of Zebedee. John, who ranks 5th on the list, is his brother, to make sure that you understand who that is. Philip comes in at 61st on the most popular names. There's no qualifier used for Philip. Bartholomew is 50th on the list of the most popular names. There's no qualifier. Thomas doesn't even appear in the top 100. There's no qualifier for him. Thomas means twin. I imagine they actually were a twin. At that time, they called you what you were. Probably not many twins at that time. Matthew comes in at number 9, and since he's high-ranking, he's called the tax collector. James is 11th place, and he's called the son of Alphaeus. Thaddeus is 39th place, a low-ranking name, no qualifier. Simon, of course, number 1, called the Canaanite. Judas is number 4 in popularity, and he's given the name Iscariot. All these qualifiers. How did the gospel writers know this? How could they know this? Because they are reporting what actually happened, even though they're writing thousands of miles away from the events of the record. They write with accuracy that could only actually be tested 20 years ago, very recently. Now, there's another piece of evidence that goes right along with this. These qualifiers also happen when speech is reported in the Gospels. Turn to Matthew chapter 14. And this goes directly to the question of whether the writers knew what happened. Did they actually know what happened? Were the Gospels based on eyewitness accounts? So we're going to read a section here where direct speech is being recorded. Actual dialogue is being recorded. Look at Matthew chapter 14 and verse 1 and 2. At that time Herod the Tetrarch heard of the fame of Jesus and said unto his servants, This is John the Baptist, he's risen from the dead, and therefore mighty works do show forth themselves in him. Do you see that? It's an actual quote. Now, Herod wants to say that Jesus is John the Baptist come back from the dead, but he just can't, he can't just say, this is John, no qualifier, come back from the dead. There were thousands of Johns. Which John are you talking about? John's a very popular name. So when Herod said to his servants, this is John the Baptist, he said this because he had to distinguish which John he was talking about. But after Herod said this is John the Baptist, the narrator telling the story can continue to talk about John without a qualifier because now we know who he's talking about. And they do. They continue on with just John. So we've already established which John we're talking about, so the narrator doesn't have to keep saying John the Baptist, John the Baptist, John the Baptist, right, over and over and over again. And then in Matthew chapter 14 and verse 8, in one of the more gory stories of the Bible, we see that Herodias, his daughter, asked for John's head on a platter. Verse 8, and she being before instructed of her mother, said, Give me here John Baptist's head in a charger. So remember, the writer had just been saying, John, 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 John. We know it's John the Baptist because Herod said it. But when her speech is being reported, she specifies. Which John are we talking about? She would have known there were hundreds of Johns even in that place. But she says, I want the head of John the Baptist. Now, if you're just narrating the story, you wouldn't need to include the detail. You know which John you're talking about. But since the author is reporting direct speech, the dialogue specifies when it is necessary. And this happens all over the New Testament. This is just one place. We have a second test, not just what people were called, but what was the main character called in the Gospels. Who's the main character? Jesus. Jesus is the main character of the Gospels. We can look at other Gospels that were written making claims, and these are outside sources, okay, not true parts of the Bible, like apocryphal books, which are dubious. I'll give you an example. There's the Gospel of Philip that was written 150 years after the time of Christ. And the Gospel of Philip is written outside the land of origin, way after events. He calls the main character not Jesus, but he calls the main character Christ. There's another gospel called the Gospel of Peter. And it doesn't call him Christ or Jesus, it calls him Lord. The Gospel of Mary calls him Savior. In later writings, the name actually drops out. And names are one of the first things to drop out. The details start to fall. Have you ever watched a good movie where you're like, so enamored with the plot and you remember it so well and you thought to yourself, man, this is such a good movie. I'm going to tell my friends about it, my family. And you just couldn't remember the name of the characters. You remember the plot, but the name just escapes you. Couldn't remember. That's what happens. The names drop out quickly. And then some of the details over time. And we see this with the Gospels that were written many years after the event, these false Gospels. Jesus, the main character, is what he was referred to in all four Gospels. We have another test that we can look at, and this is the test of geography. I was thinking there was one other thing that maybe I missed. No, that's not it. It'll come to me later. But we have another place that we can look to for a test on the authenticity of the New Testament, and that is the test of geography. Do the authors know the place that they're describing? People's knowledge of geography can be very questionable in places that they don't live in, and even places, frankly, that they do live in. You could take a city that you've been to many times, and you could forget a lot of the details that you've been in there. I've visited Pittsburgh several times, and I could tell you some things about Pittsburgh, but I don't know how the neighborhoods fit together. I don't know the ins and outs of that. I don't know the landscape particularly well. I know very little about the culture of Pittsburgh. It's different. It's definitely different than other places around, So when you're talking about a place that is distant from yourself, and remember, we're talking about the ancient where there's no internet, there's no place you can snoop, there's no particularly specific maps, your knowledge of that place is going to be questionable. The gospel writers, if they had not lived in Israel or had not eyewitnessed these accounts, how could their knowledge be what it was that we see in the Gospels? In the Gospels, the most common mentioned place is Jerusalem. Number one is Jerusalem. There are 66 references to the capital city. The next is Nazareth. There are 21 references. This is the place where Jesus grew up. These are the only places mentioned, though. There is Capernaum. I'm sorry, that's not the only places. There's also Capernaum, mentioned 16 times. Then other places like Bethany, there's Bethlehem, Bethsaida, Jericho, Sidon, Tyre, Anon, Bethpage, Caesarea Philippi, Cana, Chorazin. There's a lot of little cities that are mentioned. These tiny little villages sometimes are mentioned in the gospel. And many of these places, like Bethpage, for instance, wouldn't even be found on Roman maps. You wouldn't even know they existed if you were 1,000 or 6,000 miles away. They're tiny little villages. But they don't just know the names of the places. They also know things about them. For instance, like that Capernaum is next to the sea. They know traveling times between the towns. They know how long it takes to go from one place to the other. How did they know this? How did they get so much right? What if we compare this to the apocryphal Gospels, which were written much later by people who had no direct contact with events they were describing? The differences are quite staggering. It shows us the nature of eyewitness testimony that we're dealing with in the Gospels. So the four Gospels mention 12 to 14 towns each, a total of 23 places. Okay? 23 places. The Gospel of Philip, apocryphal, not part of the canon, mentions 2 places, Jerusalem and Nazareth. And it thinks that Nazareth is Jesus' middle name. It doesn't even know it's a place. The Gospel of Peter mentions 1 town, Jerusalem. And the other 2nd and 3rd century Gospels mention no specific places whatsoever. That's what happens when people make up stories far, far away from the events that happened a long time ago. The details start to fall out. So, what if the 4 Gospels are actually telling us things that happened? What if they did that? They mention places naturally, not in an intrusive way because they're historical accounts written about real time and real place. And then finally, there's the test of botany and other details. In the story of Zacchaeus, for example, we read about the sycamore fig tree in Jericho written about by Luke. Are there really fig trees in Jericho? Sycamore fig trees? Yes, actually there are. Now, how would Luke know it? Because he went there or he spoke to somebody who was there and he reported it. And this is the sort of thing that people who have been to a place know. The gospel writers get the names right, they get the plants right, they get the geography right, they get the shapes of the houses right, they get the coins right, they get the shape of the temple correct. There are so many opportunities to go wrong on culture, and yet they don't. The Gospels could so easily fall flat on local details, and yet they consistently get them right. The evidence points to eyewitness testimony recorded and preserved and passed down to us in a way that is truly staggering. Truly staggering. No matter what challenges are thrown at the validity of the Scriptures, God always provides an answer to the skeptic. So the question then, and I'll go back to Mr. Barnett again, what if everything in the New Testament were true? What if Jesus, the Son of God, did come down and he did give his life for you and for me? And he went through a torturous end to pay the penalty of death for our sins. What if that were all true? What if he was resurrected to life? And he sits at the right hand of the Father, and the Holy Spirit comes and indwells with us, his people. What if it were all true? We know it is, because that's why we're sitting here today. It's a remarkable example and testimony for what God the Father and the Son did for us to preserve this wonderful copy of Scriptures that we do know is absolutely 100% accurate and true.